Scott Pendlebury from the Collingwood Football Club. You're listening to the Coaches Panel.
This is Patrick from the Carlton Footy Club. You're listening to the Coaches Panel.
Max Gorn, Melbourne Football Club. You're listening to the Coaches Panel.
And we hit the teams of the 50 most relevant. Christian Petracca, a perennial top-line premium midfielder, now coming at a price point I haven't seen for a long, long time. Is this star of the AFL undeniable value? Or are there reasons and narrative for why he'll still be okay, but not quite enough to be what we hope he could in 2025? We're talking about one of the greatest players of the modern era, Christian Petracca. And joining me on this podcast, I said to you, and I promised you I would bring him back. You might not have thought it was only 5 days later, though, but from the fantasy marketplace, it is the man himself, Rowan. Mate, nice to see you. Talking about an incredible footballer in CP5.
100%, MJ. It's fantastic to be on again, so thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to talk about this player. I think there's some complexity here to whether we choose him or not in our starting sides, whether you're a SuperCoach or AFL Fantasy. I think there's some things here to really dig into that I'm looking forward to. So, keen to hear what you think as well, MJ, about old mate Petracca.
Oh, I got some thoughts, that's for sure. A seasonal average of 90.2 in AFL Fantasy and Dream Team, meaning he's priced in a range we have not seen for a long, long time. $992,000 is not quite right. It's $923K. I've got to be honest with you. And it's $914,200 in Dream Team. While for SuperCoach, a SuperCoach average of 103.2 means he's just priced over $550,000. Coming off 13 games, it was not the season we had expected, but there was still some decent ceiling games that went throughout it. A 146 was his season highest score against the Hawks right near the start of the year. He's got some ceiling about him in his career, though. A 189 against the Crows in 2022 is his career high SuperCoach score, while in AFL Fantasy, we're looking at a 134 against the Blues was his top score last season, while just a few years before that in AFL Fantasy, a 153 against Port Adelaide. So clearly some career numbers he likes against the South Australian teams. Maybe we should check the fixture and see where that is coming. Rowan, so much of last year was just a challenging year for Melbourne. And despite so much ultimately going wrong with an absolute freak, once in a lifetime type of injury that we would ever see on a football field, like car crash style impact upon his body. Despite such a horrific incident, which we will unpack through the episode, we've still got a guy before that statistically is hitting some really critical areas that are important, not only for fantasy scoring, but ultimately for Melbourne as well. Like, he's the number 2 player per game for score involvements. He's 3rd in the league for goal assists. And to go alongside that, he's 9th for inside 50s. Now, that's clearly because he spent some more time forward for us last year, but at his peak, he is one of the hardest one-on-one matchups inside forward 50. And then over the last handful of seasons, Rowan, he has built a midfield game about him that if there is a clearance to be won, if there is something that needs to be done to create score involvement and opportunity to impact the scoreboard for the deep, this guy is just an out-and-out star. We probably don't need to spend too much time focusing on last year, although we will. This is just at his peak, at full health, probably top 5 player in the competition.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, there's no denying it. There's no denying who he is. I think as well, to add to that, he's a meters gained guy. He is second at Melbourne last year per game. He was second at Melbourne for meters gained. He was first at Melbourne for meters gained in 2023, putting up 472 meters gained. It's phenomenal what he can do, and that shows the importance of who Christian Petracca is to the team. And I think that's what I want to think about a little bit here is what has Christian Petracca done for Melbourne, and what happened when he left? What happened when Petracca got injured? If we look at the team AFL points for Melbourne, like it dropped drastically. Went from 1,526 points per game, which is pretty much league average, or just above. It dropped to 1,459 after the track injury. Now, you also can say, well, Gawn was injured for a little bit in that as well. So, like, really the second half of Melbourne's season was a bit of a train wreck, or a lot of that. Oliver also lost 15 points per game off of his average after Petracca went. And so what we're highlighting here is just how valuable Petracca is to the team. And when you see that, then when they're coming back from something, and I don't know if you can totally expect Melbourne to be what they were in that second half of the year. Like, they're getting their best player back on the park. And so when we're looking at how this is shifting, I think it's important to think through, well, not just Petracca, but the whole team should be getting better with Petracca in it. But what we also can see is that actually Petracca isn't always going to be the one to create, points off of the turnover. And that's where a lot of points can be generated. And he's a guy that loves to get from the turnover. And so there's a question mark here, MJ. I'm interested to hear your thoughts on what's been happening in Melbourne beyond Petracca, beyond Gawn, beyond Oliver. There's this supporting cast around him. And I think we have to ask the question, what's that backline like? We got May and Lever, who have been there for such a long time, and causing turnovers and really allowing Melbourne to, be that top four side, which they were. And Petracca, if you look at his points per game, they mirror that a lot. Like, as Melbourne were fantastic, Petracca was fantastic. And so I think there's a question of team here and what they can do holistically. And I think that's a really important thing to dive into as well.
I think so. So much of his year last year, and at times in the season or two prior, as Melbourne has unfortunately descended from this premiership unbelievable season in 2021, as they've descended away from being top four, not winning finals, to now in this most recent season, not winning it. So much around this team has not functioned. And I think you've beautifully articulated that track has held the keys to the kingdom for so much, that they've been able to mask and hide a few things, but it really got exposed last year with just a misfunctioning forward line. At times they've been able to kind of piece it together a little bit, but then last year, despite an Angus Brayshaw retirement, which would say clearly means it's going to leave a gaping hole in your midfield rotation, such was the dysfunction of this Melbourne forward line. It was, we have to move Petracca out of this mix, hope that Clary can get it done, hope that Viney, hope that Sparrow, hope that Rivers can at least be even. We're going to weaken our midfield and hope that this can patch some forward line issues. And that's one of the core reasons that coaches and fans were hoping, going, do we get forward status? Do we get forward status? Do we get forward status? You don't, but we did. That was why there was that hope, and why we saw a drop in his scoring, his centre bounce attendance rate. We only saw 5 tons last year from 13 games in fantasy, and just the 2 over 120. He's never been a monster frequency of ceiling guy in fantasy, but it's there. SuperCoach, again, a big drop away from historically what he's always been. He's a 103.2 guy last year. Just the 6 tons. There are a couple of decent 120 plus scores. There's some 140s in there. Only a couple of sub-80s. We know his impact per possession and uses the ball so well. So favourable SuperCoach scorer. But Rowan, these are just his last 4 seasonal ranks of 2023 backwards of where he's been from a points overall perspective. In SuperCoach, 3, 9, 16, and 7 overall. So 3 top 10 years and 1 not far off it, while in fantasy, 9, 11, 8, and 11. So here is a player that has unbelievable scoring pedigree, unbelievable power. But as you've mentioned, this Melbourne team is not where it used to be. And so we've talked about this role change that happened last year and what the causation was, and a 56% centre bounce attendance rate, the lowest since this data tracking has happened. The 4 seasons prior was a 61, a 75, a 79, a 66. And so with so much dysfunction going wrong and Petracca being the thing that was moved around to fix it, I think there's one core question I've got to ask for. There's a lot of them, but there's one big one. Have the Demons fixed this forward line issue in the off-season with either health or recruits? Because if not, there's not a clear, compelling pathway for him to get back to a 10 to 15 points per game jump and a 10 to 15% movement back into that centre bounce.
Yeah, I agree, MJ. And when I look at Melbourne's ins and outs over the off season, I'm seeing some draft picks. I'm seeing Tom Campbell, perennial backup ruckman, and that's it. And they've lost Alex Neil-Bullen, who has been really solid for them as that half forward type player. So my answer is no. I don't think Melbourne have fixed their forward woes. Like, you're looking at that improvement, right, across the board from guys like Chandler and Jacob Van Ruin, and like, you want them to take the next step. But I don't think structurally they've really changed much. And so that does give me a bit of worry. The other thing that gives me a bit of worry with this is that Trent Rivers has entered into that midfield and looks pretty good. Last year when he stepped in, Trent Rivers actually became the number one guy for metres gained through that midfield. He was one of the only noticeable people at Melbourne to actually go up in points per game when Petracca left. Like I said before, Oliver went down 15 points a game. Max Gawn also went down, but he was injured. But Trent Rivers went up 12.2 points per game with that 64.5% CBA rate. Became second on the team with 6.12% of the market share of fantasy points in that time. And what was really interesting as well, to flip it back to defense, is that Rivers actually, like, before going in there, he was averaging 1.1 defensive 1 versus 1 contests and only at a 14.3% loss rate, which is, that's really, really good. That was second best for players that average more than one defensive 1v1 per game in 2023. And suddenly he's being moved into the midfield and he's averaging 0.3 defensive 1v1s in 2024. And likely even less from the point where Track got injured. And so in my mind, they've not only have they lost something from the forward line where they have to put Track into that, they've also lost Alex Neil-Bullen. In the defensive mindset, well, they had to move Rivers into the midfield, which meant that they had less people able to actually win those 1v1s in the back line. And so what we see is this change in transition points. Like, typically, there was a lot of points gained by Melbourne for taking the ball from the back line to the forward line. Petracca is involved in that chain, and sometimes he's the guy kicking the goal. He's averaging a goal a game over his career almost. And so, like, you love that for him. But are we actually going to get that? Are we going to see that consistently? Because the transition points dropped massively. I think by about 80 points per game, the transition points dropped when Track left, even though as a team they were actually generating heaps more turnovers. But that probably speaks to the idea that they were losing the ball much more in the midfield and the forward line. It was getting kicked back and they had to fight for the ball a heck of a lot more. They had to generate more turnover simply because there was more ball going down there. And so Petracca actually leaving the side meant that the chains got disrupted. It meant that the ability to move that ball was severely hampered. And so if he's not going to be a full-time mid or a really top-end mid, and the defensive structure is still the same and the forward line is still having their struggles, then as a team, I worry for Melbourne. I really do worry for Melbourne. You want Clayton Oliver to be his best. And I think this is actually really important for Petracca. He needs his bestie. They work really well. They're the ones that are going 1-2 through the midfield after the turnover, pushing it down the field, ending with that Track goal. But Clayton Oliver needs to be part of that situation as well. And he was clearly underdone last year. And that just meant that as a team, they started to fall apart. Track was doing his best, I reckon, in that first half of the season to kind of hold things together. But it's not what we're seeing now. And, well, what we saw in the second half of the year, sorry. But so we have to ask that question. There's an unknown. Does Trent Rivers stay in there in the guts and allowing Petracca to kind of be that half forward or like, half mid, half forward? So what we determine of that and what the viewers and listeners determine from that will probably play a really big part in whether they are going to put track in their side and whether they think that there is that 10-point upside in both codes.
Yeah, I think the encouraging thing for Melbourne, and you talk about this supporting cast and how critical Petracca is to their scoring. We mentioned right at the top of the episode, like he sits top of the tree, top 5, top 10, top 2 in score involvements, goal assists, like impacting the scoreboard. And then you've talked about how his turnover involvement of the points from turnover and scoring change from the back line that impacts through there. I think the encouraging thing that Melbourne fans and Petracca truthers might be holding on to is, well, Clayton Oliver has had all media reports and all track watchers say Clary is back. We are seeing the focus, the fitness, the athleticism, the power, the hunger. We're seeing that, and we didn't see that for the past few seasons. You then see a Caleb Windsor who is moved to half back and using his speed and creativity to give them something that they've really lacked for a number of years. You mentioned how critical Lever and May have been to these intercept and then slingshot to create these turnover point opportunities. Well, they now have some speed on the ball and a classy ball user. That gap in the wing, they believe they fixed that with a Xavier Lindsay, who again, silky smooth ball user, real creative type, and has some wheels. And then the other draftee is a Harvey Langford who can be that hard one-on-one matchup that can add some power, add some marking presence, and can impact the scoreboard. And while these are young players, these are first and second year players that we are talking about outside of Oliver that are being the supporting cast, if these kind of options can at least hold water, where historically the Ds have just leaked in these spots, let alone if McAdam can stay fit, if Fritsch can refine form, if Pickett can actually deliver consistently for a couple of weeks. I know these are a lot of ifs for us here, Rowan, to say that's the pathway, but 2 or 3 of those land, and all of a sudden the Petracca hesitancy that is rightfully there and understandably there in terms of role, how he scores, all those variables. 2 or 3 of those pop and stick to at least be solid. Well, I see a pathway back to a 60-40 split and a guy that's a 105 guy in AF and knocking on the door of 110 plus in SuperCoach again.
Whether you're ordering wings for the game, whipping up a 7-layer dip, or ordering pizza, there's something about football that makes you want to eat. And this football season, Uber Eats has the best deals on game day food. No matter what you're craving, from 2-for-1 pizza to buy one, get one wings, Uber Eats will be dropping new deals each week, all season long. Uber Eats, official on-demand delivery partner of the NFL. Order now. Terms and conditions apply. See app for details.
Your neighborhood just got cooler with Kroger Delivery's refrigerated trucks. Simply order groceries at the same great prices online as in-store, and we'll bring them to you fresh every time. And if that wasn't cool enough, you can now earn 4 times the fuel points after 4 with your digital coupon. Choose a next-day Kroger Delivery time slot for 4 p.m. or later on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays. Must deliver by February 4th. Restrictions apply. See Kroger.com for details.
Yeah, the avenue's there.
Yeah.
It's definitely there, and Melbourne would want that for Petracca. I think they absolutely want that. They want him to be in that prime position for that. So I think there is a lot of hope. But it's the preseason, and there's a lot of hopium going around. And so, look, color me skeptical that a lot of these reports are always positive. You're not hearing anything really negative unless it's an injury these days. And so, look, I'd love to believe it. I absolutely would. But yeah, I think I lean in that skeptical camp of seeing Melbourne fall off a bit of a cliff, especially in terms of ladder position and in terms of drop, in terms of actual fantasy production as well. It leads me to that camp. I think in SuperCoach, it's a little bit different, right? Because SuperCoach, you get to value the quality of the player no matter where they are on the ground. And so Petracca has that opportunity to still be a super high quality SuperCoach player. So I'm definitely less worried in that space because Melbourne going to put him in every situation to try and be the contested ball that will kick goals. Like, that's what you want. That's phenomenal. So, but in fantasy, that just doesn't always cut the mustard, unfortunately.
Yeah, no, it's so true. And we've got so many options in this range too. Like, just a handful of days ago, you and I are talking about Tim Taranto, who is slightly cheaper in SuperCoach, slightly more expensive in fantasy. You've got a plethora of these other names and options that are within 5 to 10 points of price point that might not have as much scoring upside as what Petracca could present to us based on his historical pedigree, but doesn't have as much friction in terms of role and whether or not this supporting cast team can rise the tide back to elevate him to his scoring best. So it's an interesting pocket of selection for us, isn't it? It's why I look at the ownership roll and go 4% in AFL Fantasy, 5% in SuperCoach, 2% in Dream Team. Historically, this is the guy we should all fall over ourselves to go and get of a near 120 guy in SuperCoach, a 110 almost guy in fantasy. And yet we're not going there. And I think it is because of that hesitation that you've mapped out beautifully for us. That's the question isn't, is Track any good? It's, can he get enough support to let him actually deliver this high-end fantasy performance?
Yeah, big time. And I think like it shows a shift in the meta of the fantasy community, I reckon, in terms of how they're prioritizing picks in their midfield. Like you said, there's Taranto, but I think other guys in there, like Will Ashcroft is just near that price point for Track as well, and he's getting a lot of buzz. Rosie's in that, high 900s, but in terms of that kind of field makeup of your M2 to M4, like typically Track would sit somewhere in that, but how we're approaching those positions is changing a lot, and people, for better or worse, don't want necessarily to have Clayton Oliver and Petracca in the same midfield, and I don't necessarily believe that that's actually necessarily a good way to analyze this, because I actually think Petracca and Oliver, especially, a little bit like a dyad in the force a little bit. They kind of, will help each other along. And if you look at the way that their season averages have gone, there's a lot of pairing where they both do well and both hit that ton, especially in SuperCoach. But you've got that. But then there's all these mid prices. It's Will Day, it's Ollie Hollins, Adam Gerrard, Peatling coming. Like
Doherty, yeah,
everyone's attracted to this now. And so, where are we? What are we going to do? How many mid prices do we want to stick in there? How many rookies are we going to be sticking in there? The way that people are talking about rookies has changed a lot over the preseason. Some people are going, "No, I almost want no rookies in my midfield," and some are going, "No, we can have 4." And so, how that works then, and how the mid prices fit into that, because we're all searching for value, which is the new, it's the buzz term, but it's not buzz. It's actually how you should play the game. You want value. All of that is going to play into this, and Petracca can just kind of be the odd man out here because he's almost too straightforward, or it's only like, I see 10 points, but I see these other guys and that could be 25 points, and I'm going to go for that. So how people choose to make up their teams will impact whether they see Petracca as actually good value or not.
Yeah, it's really true. We'll look at the draft in just a second, but fixture-wise, it's the Giants is their first game. They're not a part of opening round or early season buys, so that's a potential tick in his column as opposed to some others. But after the Giants, it's North, it's the Suns, it's the Cats, Bombers, Dockers, and Tigers. So a couple of potentially challenging matchups through there, and some really historically very good matchups, not just in terms of 2024 data, in terms of midfielders and mid-forwards, but historically for Track too. There are some of his favourite opponents lining up through there. So there's certainly the Petracca pathway to be coming back to that 105 to 110 SuperCoach comfortably. I think 110 SuperCoach is very much in his destiny. There's a 105 to 110 within him in fantasy if the variables go his way. And then there's a way where he's just a 90s guy knocking on the door of 100. There's a world in SuperCoach where he's, okay, a 105, 110 guy, and that's okay. But to really make it pop, you need that 115 going a little bit higher. And is he ever going to get enough of that mid-forward split heavy enough to pick up forward status, if he's going to do it, it's probably going to be that first DPP allocation, because it's just that portion of the year's data that is needed. What Champion Data do for us is, as each round goes, well, the percentage threshold is more and more and more. It's never just about that window of time. It's the whole season. So if Track's ever going to pick up forward status, I think it's got to be early. I think it's got to be they choose to manage elements of him or structure it. And if it does become a forward, well, all of a sudden, the bar drops a little bit. It doesn't matter whether or not he's going to be a 105 plus guy in fantasy or a 110 plus guy in Supercoach. Now it's, your 90s and you're forward. I want my hands on that. And so everything can change once the season hits. That is for sure. But on draft day, Rowan, we here at the Coaches Panel choose to draft on the Keeper platform. He does feel like the kind of guy that someone's going to reach for the historical pedigree. And then there's going to be another type of coach that is trying to play it overly cute and hope that people draft off the average. Is the truth somewhere in the middle? Where do you think he goes on draft day?
Yeah, I think with Petracca, you're looking in AFL Fantasy at probably an M3. I reckon he can sit there, and that's safe. But if you're bullish, you're probably taking him as an M2, because if you think that he's going to hit that 105, then you're probably going to go a little bit early on Petracca. But as we always say, you got to manage the thoughts and expectations of your league and where they sit with the Melbourne team and Petracca and Oliver as well. Maybe some people are thinking Oliver's just going to do better than Petracca and he might drop a little bit. That'd be great. In Supercoach, I would be saying he's an M2, but with absolute M1 upside. So, yeah, I wouldn't be afraid to take Petracca a little bit early in Supercoach either.
Yeah, I think if you're hoping in Supercoach for him to drift to an M3, you're just hoping too high. With a guy that's knocked on the door of near 120s for multiple seasons. Yes, you're probably going to get him in the third round, which is a wild thought of where Track has normally been a perennial first rounder. He might sneak to an M3 space if you go mid in AFL Fantasy. Okay, whether or not that's the right approach is another conversation. But yeah, if you're hoping to get him at M3 in Supercoach, you're probably barking up a tree that I would like to draft in that league with you, if that's the case. Hey, Rowan, it's been awesome having you on another episode of the 50 Most Relevant. Barring any late scratchings, it will be the final time we speak to you during this series, but I'm sure we will find another chance to chat to you during the preseason and season proper. Where can we get in touch with you and the great work you're doing with the fantasy marketplace?
Yeah, mostly on X. That's where a lot of my stuff is. So it's Rowan, the AFL Fantasy Marketplace, or at Rowan TAFM. And yeah, come along for the ride. It should be a good fun season. Looking forward to it.
Absolutely. Hey, we've put those links in the description of our episode. Make sure you give him a follow. Even if you're not a AFL Fantasy or Dream Team player and you're like, oh, that data stuff's not really the pure stuff I'm looking for. It's not Supercoach. Jump in there, because there are some threads and some observations that are there around the pure footballing data that's not Supercoach nuanced, that I think could really give you some keen insights, because he's doing some work in and for the community that not too many others are. So even if you're like, I'm not a fantasy or a dream team guy, I'm not interested. No. As you've been hearing through this episode, his ability to articulate statistical elements and draw threads from them to help us understand the game of fantasy football is absolutely elite. So please make sure, if you're on X, go and follow him. Inside the details of our episode is where you can find that. And look, everything else. You can go and get all our social media links. You can get in touch with us across social media. You can join our Patreon. We just dropped literally the other day my top 50 defender ranks for our premium and also our breakout tier supporters. They've got projected averages. It is all there. We're about to drop the other lines, and there's a bunch of other stuff. So if you're drafting on the Keeper platform or that same scoring platform, you can go and check that out as well. Hey, thank you so much. If you've been watching this video, thank you. If you haven't subscribed, make sure you jump in, go do it. Super easy and quick. And make sure you give the video a like too. It's a very small thing, I know, but it makes a huge impact for us. If you are loving these audio podcasts, make sure you jump in, you subscribe, and also give it a 5-star rating. And if you are an Apple podcast, you can leave us a review. I promised, I said, if someone jumped in and gave us a review, I'd read it out, whether it was bad or whether it was good. Thankfully, there's one that's just dropped in the other day that was good. So I don't have to read a bad thing. But Frio Girl jumped in and said, look, it's a quality show. It's very informative as usual, and loving the variety of quality guests you're bringing on to the show. Just so you know, Rowan, this was after you had joined the podcast. So this is not a precursor to you. So good news for that as well. Hey, thank you to the Frio Girl one for that. If you want to leave a comment and a review on Apple Podcasts or any of the other platforms, jump in there. We'll make sure we read them as well. All right, you ready for a clue for who's at number 18? Some people have been getting dangerously close on a couple of these guesses and even got a couple. So you're getting good, but also to be fair, the number of names are fastly diminishing about who it could be. And maybe I'm just getting bad at giving the clues. Whatever it is, here's one last one to see if you can figure out who's at number 18. For half of the season of 2024, this player averaged over 110 in AFL Fantasy and averaged near on 120 in SuperCoach. For half of the season. And he's priced under 100 across the formats. He's a guy that when I mention his name to her and you see that thumbnail picture come up, you're like, did he really nearly go almost 120 for half of the season in SuperCoach? He's not normally the guy you view as the SuperCoach player. He's more a fantasy guy. But yeah, he's that good. Could you get a 110 plus guy in fantasy and a near 120 guy in SuperCoach? Priced under 100 across the formats? Yeah, you can. You'll find out who he is tomorrow in the 50 Most Relevant.